There was a point about halfway through Gene Reign where I just gave up trying to figure out what was going on. That's not from a lack of trying, but rather the fact that nothing in this game makes sense. From the incomprehensible voice acting, to the confusing story, to the terrible cliffhanger ending, I was left completely dumbfounded by almost every second of this debut release from Deeli Network. This is not how you start a brand new science fiction franchise. Set a few decades in the future, this is the story of a world that has been radically changed by an event known as the Gene Reign. We learn from a brief video, and from reading the descriptions on the Steam page, that humans, robots, and hybrids are forced to put their differences aside and work together to end the world's conflicts. This basically means jumping between 3 different characters and getting sucked into an obscene amount of cover-based firefights. A large portion of this game is told through flashbacks, which allow us to see the various parts of the war through the eyes of the different factions. There's Li Ying, the human, Solomon, the robot, and a half-human, half-robot hybrid named Alex. I'd tell you more about them, but this game doesn't give you the opportunity to get to know who they are or what their personality is like. For all intents and purposes, all 3 of them could have been robots. They're basically just third-person avatars that get into a bunch of repetitive shootouts. At its best, Gene Reign feels like a low-budget version of Gears of War. The characters feel heavy and lumber around the stage just waiting to get into the next skirmish. The problem is that those skirmishes is all this game has. This is the kind of game where you walk through an empty and linear stage until you get to a long, drawn-out fight. Then more walking, fighting, and so on. With the exception of the confusing cinemas, there's nothing that breaks up this game from this simple and monotonous loop. Now you could argue that this is the same structure that made the Gears of War games so popular, but that'd be selling them short. Those games knew how to change the atmosphere between stages, give us real character moments, and make every location more interesting than the last. There's nothing like that in Gene Reign. The stages look fine, but are mostly empty and lifeless. There's no care put into the plotting or pacing, and I never got a sense of who these characters were. It's just an excuse to walk forward, fight, walk forward, fight, walk forward, and you get the point. It certainly doesn't help that the third-person action is a mess. Much like Gears, the idea is to hide behind cover and take shots at the enemies in the distance. The problem is that this game has a bad habit of popping you out of cover for no reason, and not just once or twice, but all the time. In practically every single skirmish. It often feels like it happens completely randomly and usually means that you're going to take a massive amount of damage or even die. And that isn't the only problem with the combat. I found the Amoses to be overbearing to the point of making certain boss battles nearly impossible to play. I think the game is supposed to target the enemy nearest to your reticle, but that rarely happens, if ever. It felt like every time I'd pull the trigger, I'd target some random guy who's far away from the action. This is especially bad when you're trying to focus on a boss in the distance and your cursor keeps getting dragged to other enemies. This also happens when you try to manually aim, leading to some truly frustrating firefights. Oh, and did I mention that the game isn't very good at remembering your preferred settings? I'm somebody who plays these games with an inverted look, so you can probably imagine how jarring it is when the game mysteriously switches back to the standard look for no reason. And don't think you can just change it in the options, because there are certain characters and mech suits that force players to use the standard look, which meant that I was constantly going from inverted to standard back to inverted. How is this kind of thing still happening in 2018? Speaking of which, the voice acting is atrocious. There are characters here with major speaking parts that are nearly impossible to understand due to the broken English. And I'm not even sure that real people provided all the voices. There's a human in the game with a voice so robotic that I'm convinced that it was created using one of those text-to-speech voice generators. I'm serious, just listen for yourself.
My clansmen are out there. Do you want them to come in? They know better about the value of sacrifice than you human.
I don't think it is worth to reserve the memories of 20 years ago. I can give you these memories. I wanted to know, are you the Lucifers in the Bible? I saw the records of Baphomet and I didn't believe it at the time. Are you the thing that European denomination wants to seal?
The whole thing is made so much worse by the sound mixing, which has the music at least 5 times louder than it needs to be at any given moment. Between the broken English and the music, I had a hard time knowing what was going on. Subtitles are an absolute must. And then there's the ending, which is easily one of the most anticlimactic conclusions I've ever seen. I won't get into spoilers here, but it's worth noting that Gene Rain ends with the words "to be continued." There's no satisfying ending here, just a bunch of questions I could barely hear over the music. And considering that I'm dubious we'll actually see this series continue, I think it's a pretty terrible way to end a game. It's a real slap in the face. At its best, Gene Rain is a monotonous third-person shooter with an ambitious story. Unfortunately, the shoddy combat, questionable voice acting, incomprehensible story, and lifeless characters make this short action game feel like a real slog. It doesn't help that it has one of the least satisfying endings in recent memory. This game is a mess. Hey, thanks for watching our review. So here's the question I have for you. What's your favorite science fiction game? Yeah, I know, it's a broad question. It makes up close to 80% of the games out there, so you probably shouldn't have any trouble coming up with a name. I mean, there's Mass Effect, Strider, Mirror's Edge, Quartet. Do people even still remember Quartet? I wonder if it still holds up. Anyway, let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, I'm currently hard at work on reviews of Trago, Narcosis, Mugsters, and more. So do me a favor and click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.